In 1471, Portuguese mariners arrived in Ghana and established direct sea trade with Europe. Europe was interested in the country because it was a good source of gold, which was readily available along the coast. This gave it the name Gold Coast, which Ghana was known as before 1957 when the country gained independence. The Portuguese tried to gain a monopoly over the Gold Coast and its trade by building stone fortresses along the coast, starting with Elmina Castle in 1482. Word of the Gold Coast spread, and in the 17th century traders from the Netherlands, England, Denmark, Sweden, and Prussia arrived to get in on the trade, causing Portugal to lose its already slipping grip. Following the arrival of the European traders in the 17th century, the pre-existing economic relations of Gold Coast were adapted to the export of slaves, which were in high demand for American plantations at the time. Around 40 new centers of trade controlled by the Dutch, British, and Danish began to pop up around the mid-18th century and were much more efficient than the previous overland routes. This helped them gain power and wealth. In 1867, the British government formed the British Gold Coast Colony after purchasing the Danish Gold Coast Colony in 1850. They then continued on to purchase the Dutch Gold Coast Colony, including Fort Elmina, in 1872. Britain expanded its power over the Gold Coast through the invasion and domination of local kingdoms. Before the Europeans arrived, the Ashanti people controlled most of the territory in Gold Coast. 4 wars, the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, were fought from 1822 to 1896 between the Ashanti people and the British forces. The Ashanti people eventually lost to the British forces in the Fourth War, and by 1901, British had established 3 colonies encompassing all of Gold Coast. The British ruled for 56 years thereafter with 3 colonies: Gold Coast Colony, the Ashanti Colony, and the Northern Territories, all the while instilling political globalization by integrating the European legislative system and government into the colonies. After World War I, thanks to orders from the League of Nations, a 4th colony was added to the western part of Gold Coast, Togoland. European assimilation had begun much before the colonies were established, and Gold Coast already had introduced a legislative council in 1850 and a Supreme Court in 1853. For years, the Ashanti Colony and the Northern Territories were the responsibility of the governor. From 1920 onward, governor officials were encouraged to work through the indigenous authorities, attempting a more indirect rule of the Gold Coast, which aimed to convert the Legislative Council into a fully responsible parliament. Social globalization came as a result of the introduction of permanent European bases in the mid-18th century. The bases had far-reaching consequences, and with the ideas of Eurocentrism, ethnocentrism, and slavery being quite prominent in that time period, those consequences were not always good for the locals. Their traditional ways of life became increasingly modified by contact with the Europeans and their trade. New tools, arms, techniques, wealth, and ideas were introduced through close contact with the Europeans, which instituted political, social, and economic changes to the pre-existing culture. Previously, kings and emperors had ruled the states, and people believed in traditional, indigenous religions. But as ideas of Christianity spread and Christian schools were built, many of the traditional ways were lost to history. Not much is known about the early religions and the traditional ways of life. The most powerful and wealthy areas in Gold Coast quickly declined in both aspects, sparking a union of states in the Central Forest, the Ashanti. The Ashanti didn't appreciate the assimilation that was occurring and invaded the coastal states of the European traders. The Bond of 1844 was signed, allowing the British to gain judicial authority from African courts. A legislative council was created in 1850 and a Supreme Court was created in 1853. The Ashanti and Northern Territories were the responsibility of the governor at the time. British authorities used a system of indirect rule to control their colonies since it was cost-effective, minimized local resistance, and ensured law and order. Traditional chiefs still had power, but took orders from the appointed European supervisors. In 1935, the native authorities combined the central colonial government and the local authorities into a single governing system. New native authorities appointed by the governor were given local power under the supervision of the central government's provincial commissioners, that is, as long as their policies would be those of the central governments. The new provincial courts were not popular. Even by British standards, the chiefs were no longer given enough power to have a successful indirect rule. As established earlier, Gold Coast had an abundance of easily accessible gold on the coast, hence the name, Gold Coast. Initially, this resource was what piqued Europe's interest since gold and other precious metals were very valuable and would help Europe to become richer. Once trade began, Gold Coast accounted for 10% of the world's gold. This is a very early example of economic globalization, in which the world's economies become interdependent. Once the sea routes had been adapted for the slave trade, slaves also became an important resource, since they were in high demand for American plantations. After the British colonies had been established in 1901, the British began to exploit and export many resources from Gold Coast, such as gold, diamond, ivory, timber, pepper, grain, cocoa, and manganese. By the 1920s, the colonies of Gold Coast produced over half the world's supply of cocoa, timber, and later, manganese. This is another great example of economic globalization, since the world depended on this one area for over half its supply of said goods. This made the colonies of Gold Coast very valuable to Europe, who built railways to encourage the exportation of goods. Power began to shift from the hands of the governor to those of the Ghanaians as Gold Coast progressed economically, since there was less focus on the political side of things. After World War II, ideas of nationalism spread like wildfire across the Gold Coast. Movements began and events occurred at a rapid pace, catching the colonial government off guard. As early as the 1890s, a small group of educated coastal elites created the Aborigines Rights Protection Society to protest against the government, which helped lay the foundation for the political action that eventually led to independence. In the 19th century, educated Africans found the current political system tyrannical and unfair, having all the power in the hands of the governor's appointed council members. So the 1946 Constitution required the Legislative Council to have an African majority. Following the Accra riots in 1948, Britain agreed to an African committee examining the country's government structure. In 1949, the Convention People's Party, or the CPP, set up by Kwame Nkrumah, campaigned for independence. Elections took place in 1951, and Nkrumah became the country's first premier. The 1954 Constitution allowed a legislative assembly of 104 elected members and an all-African cabinet, with Britain still controlling foreign affairs and defense. The CPP campaigned for full independence and won the 1956 election by a landslide, and Ghana achieved full independence on March 6, 1957, and was deemed a republic. In May 1956, the British part of Togoland voted to join Ghana as an independent state as well. Ghana is considered one of the most stable countries in West Africa, helped greatly by the fact that it was the first sub-Saharan nation to gain independence and by its shift to multi-party democracy in 1992. It is relatively stable economically, socially, and politically. With a population of around 30 million people and an average life expectancy of 62.74 years, Ghana has a public healthcare system and is in the 13.5% of Africa who have access to the internet. Currently, Ghana is one of the world's fastest growing economies and has a mixture of public and private businesses. It has a GDP of $67.077 billion and a growth rate of 6.8 in 2019. Ghana's economic freedom score is 59.4% and is ranked 11th in the sub-Saharan African region. Its overall score is slightly below the world average but well above the regional average. Ghana has status as one of the best governed states in West Africa and has had 5 free and fair elections in the past 20 years with 2 peaceful transfers of power. Not everything is perfect though, since people are still facing poverty, corruption, and economic inequalities. Overall, Ghana is doing pretty well and things are looking up for this developing country.